Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. This week we return to the Pentamerone for my favourite story, in the sense of it being the one that is most easily adapted to an Ars Magica saga. This is Penta the Handless. So let's start with Burton's take. Remember, he does weird faux Jacobean English. Penta scorneth to wed her brother, and cutting off her hands, sendeth them to him as a present. He commandeth that she should be put in a chest and thrown into the sea. The tide casteth her upon a seashore, a sailor findeth her, and leadeth her to his home, but his wife thrusts her again into the same chest and into the sea. She is found by king and taken to his wife, but by the wickedness of the same woman, Penta is expelled from that kingdom. After troubles and travail, she is recovered by her husband and her brother. Burton doesn't say that there's a hermetic magus mucking around in the background, but there is. I think he's a Yarburton myself, but your saga may vary. No, that's not the end of the episode. The storyteller at the beginning says virtue is tried in a crucible of troubles, but I'd suggest that's because Penta has the flaw of beauty that attracts difficulty. It's from Realms of Power Fairy, and I actually wrote it. I should know what it's called. You know the one I mean. The king of Pretaseca is a widower, and he begins to have evil thoughts about marrying his sister. His reasons are, for the period, kind of sound, and that could explain why all the Habsburgs are married cousins and have developed a weird family chin. Penta, though, points out that incest is a sin and won't have any of it. She says that just because he's lost his wits doesn't mean she's lost her virtue, and she says to him, if this was a joke, you're an ass, and if it's serious, it's a pity you have a tongue at all. She then leaves, locks herself in her bedroom and bars the door, and he mopes about for a month or so, and she gets sick of him carrying on at her door and confronts him. Look, bro, she says, I've checked my face in the mirror pretty thoroughly, and I can't see why you don't just go after someone else. And he answers, you're beautiful from head to foot, but frankly it's your hands that make me, here's a quote, faint with excessive desire. He then carries on about her hand for a page, with various metaphors, about how it's a fork on which she holds his spirit and the spoon that holds all life's sweetness, and much more besides, which I will spare you from. Penta is, you will be unsurprised to hear, entirely unmoved by this sort of carry-on, and eventually she interrupts him mid-flow by dismissing him and going back to her chamber. She then pays a witless slave to chop her hands off, telling him that she has secret arts to make them even more beautiful and white. He complies. Penta then puts the hands in a fancy basin made in the great ceramic manufactories of Veneza, covers them with a silk napkin, and sends them to her brother with a note that says, enjoy these, have good health, and twin sons. The king throws a tantrum. He orders her cast into the sea, locked in a tarred chest. She drifts until some shore fishermen capture the box and open it, and she's even more beautiful, like the Lenten moon over Taranto, apparently. The chief of the fishermen takes her home, but his wife, Nuccia, feels jealous, and she waits for him to leave the house and then loads Penta back in the box and throws her back in the sea. Eventually, the chest bumps into the boat of the king of Terra Verde. Is this the actual green land, the Terra Verde? Probably not, but I want Vikings in this story, so now it is. Deal with it, long-dead author. The king opens the chest, claims what comes in the chest is a treasure, and weeps that the casket of so many gems has no handles. He takes her home and gives her as a maid of honour to his wife, the queen. Penta does all the services of a maid with her feet, like sewing, combing the queen's hair, and the laundry. The queen begins to think of her as a daughter, and a month later, when she's dying, she makes a dying wish to her husband that he marry Penta as soon as her eyes close in death. He agrees, and his wife obliges the story by passing away in the next sentence. They marry immediately, and Penta becomes pregnant on their first night, but the king is required to sail to Antoscuglio, and so Penta gives birth before he returns. The councillors send a felucca to say, you have a beautiful son, which wrecks my Greenland theory because a felucca is a Mediterranean type of ship. Darn. The ship has a stormy passage and stops by chance at the same point where Penta was washed ashore. Again, by chance, the captain finds refuge with the woman who put Penta back in the box. The lady gets him drunk, takes the letter he has from Penta to the king, and swaps it for another. The new letter claims that the royal councillors say that Penta has given birth to a dog, or a wolf dog, and it asks for instructions. The captain is illiterate, he doesn't notice the switch. The king sends a letter back saying to his councillors that they should work hard to keep Penta in good spirits because bad things happen due to ill stars or heaven's commands, and men should make the best of them. On the way home, the ship stops at the same place, and Nuccia swaps out the letter for one saying that they should be put to death. The councillors open the letter, have a bit of a chat with each other, and conclude that the king has either gone mad or is under a spell because murdering a woman and a baby is so far beyond what they're willing to do, they're amazed he'd even ask. They give her some money and send her from the city, so no news of her can reach the king. Penta cries it out. In her reasoning, we see something odd from medieval Venice. The unhappy Penta, this is a quote, perceiving they had expelled her, though she was not a dishonest woman, nor related to bandits, nor a fastidious student, taking the child in her arms, who she watered with her tears and fed with her milk, departed and fared well toward Lago Truvio, where dwelt a magician, and beholding this wonderful maimed damsel, who moved the hearts to compassion, this beauty who made more war with her maimed arms than Briareus with his 100 hands, asked her to relate to him the whole history of her misadventures. The magician, because he's awesome, tells her not to worry, that she's found in him a mother and a father. Penta recovers from her depression, and the magician's servants treat her as if she was his daughter. The magician decides it's time to take names and kick ass. The magician hires a crier to go about telling people that whoever can come to his court and tell him the greatest tale of misfortune will be given a sceptre and a crown, both of gold, and people, more than broccoli, turn up from all over Europe, generally with stories about how noblemen have done them wrong, but also with tales of ill luck or dedicated work not rewarded. Frankly, there is a coven full of folk here. You've got scribes, courtiers, merchant adventurers, military veterans, just to name the examples given. The king of Terra Verde returns home to find he's in a fine syrup. I'm not sure what that means, but I wanted to put it in. He rages and tries to blame his councillors who show him the letter, and then the king calls the captain, who bore the message, and he works out what's going on, so he sails to the hamlet where Nuccia lives, and after charming a confession out of her, he coats her in tallow and burns her alive. Staying only to make sure that there's a body because he's aware of narrative convention, he then sails on. On the sea, he meets a vessel with Penta's brother, and they carry on with the ceremonies of king's meeting. After making friends, the two kings have a bit of a chat, and Penta's brother says he's going to Lago Truvio because the king there has offered a treasure to the most sorrow-stricken person in the world. The king of Terra Verde says he'll come too because that's him. He then soliloquizes on his pain for some time in metaphor, and the king of Preta Seca doesn't agree, but they're such good mates that they now agree to travel together and split the prize. I then start singing Agony, Misery from Into the Woods, and the woman at the desk next to me starts playing yakety sax on her phone. Who knows why? It's a fool who questions the ill-omened stars, apparently. They arrive and send to the king's palace, and the magician is all king radio, and then he takes them to his throne room, to a dais which we have not previously heard about and may have just suddenly appeared, and he knows who they are because they made very sure to tell all of his servants they are kings. Time for him to twist the knife a bit. Penta's brother begins first, and he tells of the wrong he's done and how virtuous his sister was, and how he murdered her by putting her in a box and throwing her in the sea. This causes him great grief of conscience and deep sorrow, so he's obviously the most miserable man in the world, tormented by his shame and great loss, etc. That goes on for several pages. The king of Terra Verde says, "Your problems are but small lumps of sugar and cakes and sweetmeats compared to mine, because that's the very Penta the handless of whom I have spoken. I found the chest, I took her to wife, and she conceived, and we had a lovely son, and some horrible woman did this weird thing with, so she got exiled from the kingdom, and I've never seen her again, and I'm so very miserable and sad, although I did burn the woman responsible." That was a bright point. The magician, having heard both stories, worked out which one was the brother and which one was the father, and he says to a little page boy he's got there, "Go and kiss that king's feet." And the child goes and obeys, and is such a lovely boy. They play with him and joke with him, and they go to the magician, "You've got a great kid here. Is this your son?" And the magician goes, "No." And then they go, "Well, whose son is he?" And the magician goes, "You're going to have to ask his mother." And they go, "Well, where's this mother, dude?" Because they're in a lot higher spirits than they were just half an hour ago. And then Penta, who has been hiding behind an arras, as is traditional in stories from this period, emerges, and she hugs people and cries at them. And she seems to have forgiven her brother, who, honestly, I haven't forgiven. And the story's been in print for over 1,000 years, so I'm holding a grudge. And the magician goes, "I'm a man of my word." He also says he's going to make himself a slave to the kings, but that's just flowery, courtly nonsense. And he says, "Of the two of you, I think the one who was sadder was the king of Terra Verde, so he can have a crown and a scepter, and I don't have any children, so he can also have my kingdom." And so the king of Terra Verde sends a note to Terra Verde saying to his brother, "Good news, my bro, who I've not heard of before. You're now king of Terra Verde. I'm staying here with all these cool people." The magician also says, "Hey, I've got another trick. Penta, put your hands under your apron." She says, "I don't have any hands." And he goes, "Well, stumps then." And she puts her arms under her apron, and when she pulls them out, she has restored hands that are more beautiful than they were before. Presumably, this beauty has something to do with the magician's sigil. Now, how he restores the hands like this, I'm not entirely sure, because that seems to me like ritual magic, so I'm guessing he did it the night before while she was asleep, and then used illusions to hide the hands and stop her from noticing she had hands, and then dispelled the illusions. Tricky dude. And so the king of Terra Verde and Penta reign in this magician's castle with wealth and happiness. Her brother takes the message back to Terra Verde and says to the other king there, "Hey, good news, you're king now." And the story winds up with the moral that there is naught sweet and dear unless one hath first tried the bitter. Which sounds like a foolish and privileged thing to say, but your saga may vary.